Today, I'm going to be showing you guys how I recreated About You by the 1975. This is the last song I'm going to be recreating off of the new record. And honestly, it was probably the hardest one to recreate just because there's so many like weird sound design layers. We're going to go into modulating guitar with tape echo, how to get that early 1975 weird sound design stuff, and some other fun things like me finding my new favorite saxophone VST. But before we jump into all that, let me introduce myself. Hi, my name is Seth. I produce music under the name Velvet Year. I do one of these videos every Friday to show people how to produce their own music at home. Songs I've either written or produced have been featured on these Spotify curated playlists, and I've done an entire album through Warner Music Group. So if you watch this video and you think we would have fun working on a project together, check out the top link in my description below. All right, now on to the rest of the video. So everything in this beat is kind of crazy, so why don't we start out simple with just the drums. Very soft, vintage, brushy drums. But as you can see, I'm actually using two separate layers to get that sound. So the main kit sound is actually coming from Contact's Studio Drummer, which I haven't messed around with, honestly, that much. And I think it might start becoming a regular, specifically for this kind of live sound, because I really like the way the samples are processed. But when we're listening to the beat, it's this very walking pace feel, specifically with this hit on the 8th leading into the next downbeat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, which makes it feel like it's moving a bit more than if it was just a bam, 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 bam. So I intentionally arranged this drum part as if this was an overdubbing studio situation where we could just kind of add any layers we wanted. So here we have our kick, as well as a step hat on every quarter note, and then the drum is alternating these 16th notes, which is what really adds a lot of the flavor to the beat, almost having this sort of train motion. But then we're hitting the crashes on the downbeat, and then we're hitting a ride on every 8th note. The 1975 are known for overdubbing stuff a lot, so it doesn't really matter that you need to be a four-armed drummer to play this part. And then I felt like that snare movement wasn't really being accented enough. And after listening to the song again, I realized that they were using brushes. So I just kept what I had here with this snare and then layered some slate brushes underneath it. As you can hear, I was being a little bit more aggressive with it. And then when I layered the two of them together, like if I hadn't pointed it out to you that these were two separate instruments, you probably wouldn't have even noticed. I think a lot of people don't realize how much you can get away with layering samples directly on top of each other. These guys are in a bus together, high passing to get rid of the subby low end that was present in the Contact drums, scooping some of the mids. And then for these vintage drums, I'm normally bringing down some of these highs just a tiny bit, just because I feel like a lot of sample libraries try to make the high end very open and wide and pristine. And for indie pop, we're normally trying to make it a bit darker and vintage. So I corrected that and then went into a tape distortion. If I turn that tape distortion off, you can hear the high end kind of opens up a little bit too much, at least for an indie pop track. After that, we will look at our bass. Just used a basic P bass for this, going into an Ampeg with some general shaping with the Crystal Lord Algae bass. And then for this bass tone, I was really happy with the mid-range that I got, but I feel like it was a little bit too clicky in the high end. And when I listened to the original song, it felt more like a lower mid-range bass. If I take the EQ off, you can hear that really clicky, almost like kiss of high end on the bass, which I do not like. For some genres, it does work, but with this song, I felt like it really needed to be tamed. And the fun thing about this bass is that it's kind of interacting with the kick in a way to make it feel like the beat is more busy. So like we said here's our downbeat, and we have a hit on the 8th just before that. 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3. And this bass is doing that as well, but then it also has another hit on that next 8th note. So it's 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2. And this one hit after that kick drum, it feels like it's moving a lot more than it actually is. Like if I just play this bass and then just play the drums, they can kind of feel a little bit dopey, just like they're kind of playing very simple rhythms. But when you put the two of them together, that little extra hit on the bass makes it feel like it's moving a bit more. So these two being in sync with each other is really the foundation for the song as a whole. Underneath that, we have the guitars, which I'm just gonna say right now, these are not the normal guitars that you're used to seeing on this channel. These are all really weird sound design elements. Because in the song About You, I felt like it was more about them being these textural things sort of whining in the background than an actual like part that you normally play. So the first two I did were these guys. And the point of them is I just wanted this sort of like droning, like whining, almost a siren in the background. And so I'm playing very simply. In order to get it clean and get that ringing out, I actually recorded it on 2 separate tracks just so I could have this note ring out all the way. I used my Jazz Master for both of these just to make them really noisy. And that was another thing. I was not trying to make these sound clean at all. This was the most disgusting I could make it. I used this Fuchs Train 2 amp from Plugin Alliance for this top one, and then for this lower one, I used this Broken Heart Fuzz preset and messed around with it a bit in Guitar Rig 6. And another way that I was able to get these elements to be really noisy was I threw Valhalla delay on the actual track, not on Ascend like I normally do. And what I did was after I played the guitar, I turned the feedback up a bit and then messed with this ratio knob and tracked that as automation into Ableton. So you can see here, this curve correlates to this knob. It just adds this really funky waviness to it. You can also mess around with that using the delay and the feedback knob, but I've found that when you do that, it tends to adjust the actual pitch of the note you're playing. Like a lot, you start to get some of that like fun feedback weirdness, which is cool in some instances, but I felt like with this track, there was more of an emphasis on that note staying clear. It didn't feel like they were messing around with a delay pedal. This is just a way that I was able to replicate that. But yeah, these two trade off one another. And then just as a sort of almost, I want to say a pad, I have this guy here, which I literally got from playing my 335, playing the lowest string here on like the highest fret possible, which is luckily a D, which is the key of the song. And then I grabbed this pen and then just sort of rubbed it here around the bridge. I actually like angled my hand so I could like spaz my muscle out just to get that layer. And then I just did that a couple of times and found the best segment. So if I turn off all of the effects, it sounds like this. I was actually really proud of myself for that one. And it's kind of weird and wonky and it's not perfectly in tune and it's scratchy and it sounds like a strange element, but when you take that element out of the track, it feels like there's just so much attitude and vibe missing. So yeah, when you're doing 1975 stuff, you need to be prepared to do things outside of what are the norms. After that, we have this Kalimba. It's very lightly there in the original track. I just threw it in there because I felt like it added this like nice plucky movement happening melodically up in the upper range, and there's not a whole lot of other elements doing that, so I just thought I would throw it in. It's buried in the mix a lot. And then these two guys are also just sort of weird sound design elements that I messed with, and they sound like this. And I came up with these two guys because I was a fan of the 1975 when they came out with their self-titled album, the black and white one. And I felt like this song was very reminiscent of that era of the 1975. And something I could have sworn that I heard in the original track is this sort of like weird distorted pad that they had in a lot of their songs back on that album. And you almost describe it as like a haunted carousel, just like this weird, chimey, neutrally texture that's just super distorted. And so how I got that was I went into Arcade and I found this vintage synth line and found a couple of notes that I thought had sort of neutral tones to them. And after that, I threw them into Saturation Knob by Softtube, mainly keeping it on the low end because when you turn it on the higher end, it got a little bit grating. And then I just band passed them and then ran them into some effects sense. So when I turn all of those effects off, here's what they sound like. Also on this lower one, I added an auto pan just because I wanted it to have more movement side to side. And these guys are kind of an example of why it was so hard to remake this track, is because so many of the elements in the original song are these like super unique sound design elements that I'm not sure are possible to recreate, because George from the 1975 is super into sound design as like a hobby. Like he's doing a bunch of modular synth stuff, but then they also have a lot of live performance elements. There was like a take of Maddie attacking a guitar with a violin bow, and that made it as like a sound design element. So a lot of these elements are like a close approximation to the original sounds, but they're not like quite exact, because I'm not sure if I can get them, honestly. Another element are these strings here, which are mainly credits to the orchestral stuff in Contact 7, which I've been a huge fan of. So we have a cello and a violin playing. The cello is playing more root and fifth stuff, arranged for like lead voicing. And then the violins are just kind of doing like a major chord up, alternating between the 3 and the 2. And they add like a lot of texture to the beat. But something that I found difficult was in the original song, the string players are going this sort of dun 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 motion, and there isn't really a patch set up for that. So what I did was I set them to tremolo, where they're just going like really rapidly back and forth. And then I used one knob pumper really lightly on an 8th note, and then I offset it by 180. So like it kind of emulated that like movement that they were having. And then I band passed them because they're kind of huge. Like strings always take up a lot of space in the mix. Underneath that, we have this guy, which has become my actual solution for live horns. So it's the Acoustic Samples V horns. It's very intuitive. It's very simple. If you want, you can actually arrange multiple saxophones in one plugin and then route them out as separate audio channels, which is really awesome. How hard you're blowing is mapped to the mod wheel. So I've found that it's best to just sort of approach this as if you're doing live takes and just use your mod wheel to try to simulate how hard a saxophone player would be blowing when they get to certain notes. So easing off. Like you can see, I'm sort of like easing into the notes a bit harder and then sort of backing off as the note holds out. Yeah, super happy with this. Honestly, I was making this song and I was feeling like it just wasn't hitting the mark. I felt like there was just something wrong. And then I added these guys in and it was perfect. So these are just layers of texture. They're loops that I found on Splice, and they're just adding noise, honestly, to the background. So this first one, if I bring it up, it's just sort of like this radio static. This one below it, it's a 7th chord, and it's just kind of holding out this like fuzzy texture as well. It's very organic sounding. And then underneath it, I layered this guy, which is just some vinyl crackle. And with these guys, as you can see, I've actually lowered them in the mix a lot, but just subtly blending these guys in really does a lot to add to that sort of vintage indie pop vibe. Like it just sort of carries it that last 10% over the finish line. On the master out, I'm just using a tiny bit of RC20, literally 2% magnitude on like the default preset with the default setup. And so yeah, let me show you what it all sounds like together. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed that. If you liked this video, please hit subscribe, hit the bell icon, all that stuff below. Also, if you guys have any other suggestions for indie pop type songs that you would like me to recreate, put them in the comments down below. And yeah, I will see you guys next week.